Benjamin burst into the hallway leading to Apollo's office, his steps heavy with purpose. His heart raced, unsure of what awaited him, but the tension in the air thickened as he approached the partially open door. The sight inside stopped him in his tracks. Apollo stood near the desk, while a group of people gathered in the room. A group Benjamin recognized immediately. His 4 stepfathers were there, their presence commanding as always. But what truly caught his eye was the stranger sitting on the single sofa. A man, tall, imposing, with an air of quiet dominance. Benjamin's brow furrowed as he stared. The familiarity of the man gnawed at his memory. Where had he seen him before? His mind raced, flipping through faces and places. It hit him like a lightning bolt. His bar. The man had been there, just a fleeting figure in the crowd. But now he was here, seated in Apollo's office, as though he belonged. He barely noticed the movement across the room, distracted by the realization. Then he saw her. A woman, sitting on the sofa beside the imposing man. Her presence was striking yet delicate. Her hair was shorter than he usually liked. But her face, her eyes, it was like looking at Ashley, his late wife. Every part of him froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The years of pain, the grief he'd locked away, threatened to burst free all at once. His knees felt weak, yet his gaze couldn't break away. Her wide, innocent eyes met his, and for a moment, the world around them ceased to exist. It wasn't just her face that stirred memories. It was the way she looked at him, as though she could see through every defense he'd built. Tears glistened in her eyes, and it shattered him in ways he couldn't comprehend. Apollo, sensing the tension, stepped forward. "Bro," he called out, pulling Benjamin from the trance, but his body wouldn't respond. Apollo's voice seemed distant, muffled beneath the sound of his pounding heart. Benjamin finally managed to tear his gaze away, shaking his head to ground himself. "Who is she?" His voice was hoarse, as if dragged from the depths of his soul. "And who are they?" He gestured toward the man and woman on the sofa, his expression tense and demanding. Apollo glanced at the group nervously before stepping closer to Benjamin. Lowering his voice, he whispered, "That's Preki Carrillo, one of my closest colleagues. The man next to him is his brother and the woman." Apollo hesitated, his gaze darting toward the woman before continuing, "That's Rhea, their friend." Benjamin's jaw tightened. Something about her name made his stomach twist. Rhea. The way it rolled off Apollo's tongue ignited a fire of emotions he couldn't quite place. Anger, confusion, sorrow. He smirked bitterly, his defenses rising. "Are you playing with me, Apollo?" He spat, his voice cold. "What is this? Some sort of sick joke?" Apollo's face hardened, his disappointment evident. "What the hell are you talking about, Benjamin? I'd never." But Benjamin wasn't listening. His emotions were spiraling, and every rational thought drowned beneath the storm raging inside him. He stepped closer to Apollo, their faces inches apart. "Don't lie to me," he growled. "Don't you dare. Are you trying to drag me back to the days when I was nothing? A useless wreck?" "Hey, Benjamin!" A voice thundered from behind. His stepfather, Jackson, had risen, his expression a mix of frustration and warning. "That's enough." Benjamin hesitated, his clenched fists trembling. He turned away, raking a hand through his thick hair. "Fine," he muttered bitterly, but his eyes betrayed his turmoil. "I'll play along, but don't expect me to believe any of this." Before anyone could respond, Rhea's soft voice broke the silence. "I think it's best if we leave." Her tone was steady, but there was an undercurrent of fear. "It's clear we're not welcome here." Benjamin's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, you're leaving, all right," he said coldly. "But let me give you some advice before you go. The specialists in this hospital aren't in this building. If you're looking for someone competent, you're in the wrong place." Her gaze faltered, but she didn't retort. Instead, she lowered her head, her fingers fidgeting in her lap. The small, vulnerable gesture struck something in Benjamin. He hated it, hated how it made him feel. He turned away, unwilling to let anyone see the cracks forming in his armor. Preki stood, shielding Rhea with his large frame. His voice was calm but laced with steel. "I don't know who you are, Benjamin, but I suggest you watch how you speak to her. If you insult her again, I won't hesitate to put you in your place." Benjamin smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Is that a threat?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "It's a promise," Preki replied coolly, before guiding Rhea toward the door. As they passed, Rhea hesitated, her shoulder brushing against Benjamin's arm. She glanced up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and something else he couldn't identify. "Your manners are as rough as the road, sir," she said quietly, before continuing toward the exit. The words struck him harder than he cared to admit. He stood frozen, her voice echoing in his mind long after the door closed behind her. Benjamin remained rooted to the spot, his mind replaying Rhea's parting words. "Your manners are as rough as the road, sir." They echoed in his head like a haunting melody. There was something about her voice, a quiet strength beneath the pain, that refused to leave him. Apollo broke the silence, sighing heavily. "What the hell was that, Benjamin?" His voice was filled with exasperation, but also a hint of concern. "You just insulted people you don't even know. Do you realize what you've done?" Benjamin finally turned to face him, his expression guarded. "What I've done?" He let out a humorless laugh. "What I've done is walk into your office to find a woman who..." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. How could he explain what he felt when he saw her? Even he didn't understand it. Apollo shook his head, crossing his arms. "She's not Ashley, Ben." The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He shot Apollo a glare, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't say her name." "You need to face the facts," Apollo continued, undeterred. "I get it. She looks like her, but she's not her. You can't lash out at people just because they remind you of what you've lost." Benjamin's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms. "I don't need a lecture from you," he snapped. "You think I don't know that? You think I'm confused? I'm not." "Then what's your excuse?" Apollo countered. "Because all I see is a man who's terrified of facing his emotions." Benjamin opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. Apollo's words cut deeper than he cared to admit. With a frustrated growl, he stormed out of the office, leaving Apollo and the others behind. The next day, Benjamin found himself pacing the floor of his bar. It was early, and the usual crowd hadn't yet arrived, but his mind was far from the business. He couldn't stop thinking about Rhea, her face, her voice, the way she'd looked at him with a mixture of fear and strength. It was maddening. "Why can't I get her out of my head?" he muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. It wasn't like him to dwell on strangers, let alone let them affect him so deeply. He decided to distract himself with work, but as the hours passed and the bar filled with patrons, his restlessness only grew. He was about to call it a night when a familiar figure walked through the door. "Rhea." She entered hesitantly, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for someone. When her gaze landed on him, she froze. For a moment, neither of them moved, the noise of the bar fading into the background. Then, slowly, she approached. "Benjamin," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the music. He stared at her, torn between anger and something he couldn't quite name. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone colder than he intended. "I didn't come here to see you," she replied, her voice steady despite his harshness. "Preki asked me to meet him here. I didn't know this was your bar." Benjamin's eyes narrowed. "Convenient." She flinched at his sarcasm, but quickly composed herself. "I won't bother you then." She turned to leave, but something in him snapped. "Wait," he said, his voice softer this time. "Don't go." Rhea hesitated, turning back to face him. "Why?" He didn't have an answer. All he knew was that he couldn't let her leave. Not yet. "Just stay," he said simply. To his surprise, she nodded. "Fine, but only until Preki gets here." They sat at a small table in the corner, the air between them thick with tension. Benjamin couldn't take his eyes off her, but he didn't know what to say. Every time he looked at her, memories of Ashley flooded his mind, but there was something different about Rhea, something that made him want to know more. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words surprising even himself. Rhea looked up, her expression cautious. "For what?" "For the way I acted yesterday," he admitted. "I was out of line." Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she smiled, a small, tentative smile that made his chest tighten. "Thank you," she said, "but you don't have to apologize. I understand." "You do?" he asked, genuinely surprised. She nodded. "You've been through a lot. I can see it in your eyes." Her words hit him harder than he expected. How could she see through him so easily? He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "You don't know anything about me," he said gruffly. "Maybe not," she replied, "but I know what it's like to carry pain." Her honesty disarmed him. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. Just then, the door opened, and Preki entered. He spotted them immediately and made his way over, his expression unreadable. "Rhea," he said, his tone protective. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she assured him, standing up. "Thank you for meeting me." Preki's eyes flicked to Benjamin, his jaw tightening. "We should go." Rhea hesitated, glancing at Benjamin one last time. "Goodbye, Benjamin," she said softly before following Preki out the door. Benjamin watched her leave, his heart heavy with emotions he couldn't name. He didn't know what it was about Rhea, but he knew one thing for certain: she had already changed everything. Benjamin stood by the bar, nursing a glass of whiskey as the sound of the door closing behind Rhea echoed in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling she left behind, as if her presence had carved a hollow in his chest that he couldn't fill. He hated it. He hated that her face haunted him, that her voice lingered in his ears. As the night wore on, the bar emptied, leaving Benjamin alone with his thoughts. The image of Rhea, so much like Ashley, yet so different, refused to fade. He clenched his jaw, gripping the edge of the bar as memories of Ashley flooded back. Her laughter, her touch, the way she'd looked at him with love that never wavered. Losing her had broken something in him, something he didn't think could ever be repaired. Until now. Rhea's face, her voice, her quiet strength, it all called to him in ways he couldn't understand, and it terrified him. He downed the rest of his whiskey and grabbed his coat. Staying here wouldn't help. He needed air, space to clear his head. But as he stepped into the cool night, he realized there was only one place he wanted to go. Rhea sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone. The night with Benjamin still lingered in her thoughts. His apology had surprised her, but what struck her most was the pain in his eyes. She had seen it before, in her own reflection. Preki had been unusually quiet during their ride home. When they arrived, he'd given her a long, searching look before saying, "You don't have to deal with him, you know?" "I'm not dealing with him," she'd replied. But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure she believed them. Now, alone in her room, she replayed the night in her head. Benjamin's intensity, his raw emotion, the way his eyes softened when he apologized. It was as if she'd glimpsed a part of him he tried to keep hidden. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Preki. "Stay away from him, Rhea. He's not good for you." She sighed, setting the phone aside. Preki meant well, but he didn't understand. There was something about Benjamin that called to her, something she couldn't ignore. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. The next morning, she had an appointment at the hospital. The specialist Preki had recommended was supposed to be one of the best, and she was hopeful that this time, she might finally get some answers. Benjamin couldn't explain why he was there. He'd spent the entire night convincing himself to forget about Rhea, to push her out of his mind and focus on anything else. Yet here he was, standing outside the hospital, waiting for her. When he saw her walking up the steps, his heart did something it hadn't done in years. It skipped a beat. She looked surprised to see him, her eyes widening as she stopped in her tracks. "Benjamin," she said, her voice a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "What are you doing here?" He shoved his hands into his pockets, trying to appear nonchalant. "I was in the area," he lied. "Thought I'd see how you were doing." Her brow furrowed, and she crossed her arms. "You don't strike me as the type to make casual visits." He smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe I'm full of surprises." Rhea studied him for a moment before shaking her head. "Well, if you're here to make amends for last night, consider it done. You don't owe me anything." "I'm not here because I owe you," he said, his tone softening. "I'm here because—" He hesitated, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Because I can't stop thinking about you." But he couldn't say that. Before he could find the words, Preki appeared at her side, his expression darkening when he saw Benjamin. "What's he doing here?" Preki asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "I don't know," Rhea admitted, glancing at Benjamin. "I was just leaving," Benjamin said, though every part of him wanted to stay. He nodded to Rhea. "Take care of yourself." As he walked away, he heard Preki mutter something under his breath, but he didn't care. All he could think about was the look in Rhea's eyes. The same look Ashley used to give him when she wanted him to open up, to let her in. But he couldn't. Not again. Letting someone in meant risking the pain of losing them, and he wasn't sure he could survive that a second time. Benjamin drove aimlessly through the city after leaving the hospital. The streets blurred past, but his mind was fixed on Rhea. He couldn't understand why she affected him so deeply. It wasn't just her resemblance to Ashley, it was something more. Her strength, her vulnerability, the way she looked at him as if she could see through his carefully constructed walls. He pulled into the parking lot of a quiet cafe, needing a moment to think. As he sipped his coffee, memories of Ashley surfaced, unbidden. He closed his eyes, her laughter echoing in his mind. But then her face was replaced by Rhea's, and he cursed under his breath. "What's happening to me?" he muttered, running a hand through his hair. Before he could lose himself completely in his thoughts, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Apollo. "Benjamin, we need to talk. Come by the office." Benjamin sighed, finishing his coffee before heading back to Apollo's office. He wasn't in the mood for a lecture, but he knew Apollo wouldn't let him off the hook easily. Apollo was waiting for him when he arrived, leaning against his desk with a knowing look. "You're late," Apollo said, crossing his arms. Benjamin shrugged, slumping into a chair. "Didn't realize I was on a schedule." Apollo ignored the jab, his expression turning serious. "What are you doing, Benjamin?" "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean. Rhea." Benjamin stiffened at the mention of her name. "I'm not doing anything." Apollo raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're spiraling. Again." "I'm fine," Benjamin snapped, though his clenched jaw betrayed his words. Apollo sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I get it. She reminds you of Ashley. But she's not Ashley, Benjamin. And if you're not careful, you're going to hurt her and yourself." Benjamin stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't feel like a damn idiot every time I look at her?" "Then stop," Apollo said calmly. "Walk away before you get in too deep." But Benjamin couldn't walk away. The thought of never seeing Rhea again felt like a knife to his chest. He left without another word, slamming the door behind him. Rhea sat on a park bench, watching the children play on the swings. It was her favorite spot to think, a place where she could escape the chaos of her life for a little while. But today, her thoughts were anything but peaceful. Benjamin's face kept flashing in her mind. His intensity, his pain, the way he seemed to unravel in her presence. It was overwhelming. She didn't understand why he had such an effect on her, but she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. "Mind if I sit?" She looked up to see Benjamin standing there, his hands shoved in his pockets. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her heart skipping a beat. "Just needed some air," he said, sitting beside her before she could respond. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of laughter and chatter filling the space between them. I owe you an apology, Benjamin said finally, his voice low. For how I acted. I was out of line. Rhea glanced at him, surprised. You already apologized. Not properly. He turned to face her, his eyes earnest. You didn't deserve that. And I'm sorry. She studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity, but found none. Thank you, she said softly. For the first time since meeting him, Benjamin smiled. A small, tentative smile that made her chest tighten. Can I ask you something? He said after a pause. Sure. Why do you let Preki boss you around? Rhea blinked, caught off guard. He doesn't boss me around. Benjamin raised an eyebrow. Really? Because it seems like he's always telling you what to do. He's protective, she said defensively. He's been there for me when no one else was. I'm not saying he doesn't care about you, Benjamin said carefully, but you're stronger than you give yourself credit for. You don't need someone telling you how to live your life. His words hit a nerve, and Rhea looked away. You don't know me, she said quietly. I know more than you think, Benjamin replied, his voice gentle. Rhea didn't respond, her mind swirling with emotions. She wasn't sure what to make of Benjamin. This man who was both infuriating and intriguing, who seemed to see parts of her she tried to hide. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, they sat in silence, the unspoken connection between them growing stronger with each passing moment. Benjamin couldn't get the conversation with Rhea out of his head as he drove back to his apartment. Her quiet strength, the way her eyes softened when she looked at him. It was maddening and comforting all at once. But her words, "You don't know me," lingered like a challenge. As he stepped into his apartment, the silence wrapped around him. He grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the counter, pouring a glass as memories clawed their way to the surface. Ashley's laughter, the warmth of her touch, the way she whispered his name when she thought no one was listening. It all felt like a lifetime ago. He threw back the whiskey, the burn doing little to dull the ache in his chest. He couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep letting the past dictate his present. But the more he tried to let go, the tighter Ashley's ghost seemed to hold on. Before he realized it, he was scrolling through his phone, staring at the only photo he had left of her. Ashley's smile beamed back at him, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel comforted by it. Instead, he felt an overwhelming guilt, as if his growing feelings for Rhea were a betrayal. Damn it, he muttered, tossing his phone onto the couch. He downed another glass of whiskey before collapsing onto the sofa, his mind racing until sleep finally claimed him. Rhea stood outside Preki's office, her hands gripping the strap of her bag. She could hear his voice inside, firm and commanding as he spoke to someone on the phone. Part of her wanted to turn around and leave, but she knew she couldn't keep avoiding the conversation they needed to have. When Preki finally noticed her through the glass door, he waved her in, ending his call abruptly. Rhea, he said with a smile, standing to greet her, what brings you here? She hesitated, unsure how to start. I wanted to talk to you about Benjamin. Preki's expression darkened slightly. What about him? I think you're being too hard on him, she said, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. Preki leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. Rhea, you don't know him like I do. Benjamin's reckless. He doesn't care about anyone but himself. That's not true, Rhea said, surprising even herself with the conviction in her tone. He's been through a lot, Preki. Maybe he just needs someone to believe in him. Preki's jaw tightened. And you think that someone is you? Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't back down. Maybe. Or maybe it's you. You used to be his friend, didn't you? What happened to that? Preki sighed, running a hand through his hair. Benjamin changed after Ashley died. He shut everyone out, Rhea. He became a shell of the man he used to be. Maybe that's because no one stayed to help him, she said quietly. Preki stared at her, his expression unreadable. Just be careful, Rhea. He's not as strong as he pretends to be, and neither are you. The comment stung, But Rhea refused to let it show. "Thanks for the warning," she said, turning to leave. Benjamin hadn't planned on seeing Rhea again so soon, but fate, or perhaps his own subconscious, had other plans. He found himself outside the community center where she volunteered, watching her through the large glass windows as she interacted with a group of children. She was laughing, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she helped a little girl tie her shoelaces. The sight tugged at something deep inside him, something he thought had died along with Ashley. He didn't realize he was smiling until Rhea looked up and spotted him. Her laughter faded, replaced by a look of surprise. She said something to the children before walking outside to meet him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Honestly, I don't know," he admitted. "I was driving, and I ended up here." Rhea raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "You just happened to end up here?" Benjamin smirked, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Okay, maybe I wanted to see you." Her cheeks turned pink, but she quickly composed herself. "Why?" The question caught him off guard. He'd asked himself the same thing 100 times, but he still didn't have an answer. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but when I'm around you, I don't feel so lost." Rhea's expression softened, and for a moment, they just stood there, the weight of his words hanging between them. "You're not the only one who feels lost, Benjamin," she said finally. He took a step closer, his gaze locking onto hers. "Then maybe we can help each other." Rhea's breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to say yes, but the fear of getting hurt again held her back. Before she could respond, one of the children called her name from inside. She glanced over her shoulder, then back at Benjamin. "I have to go," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "Rhea," Benjamin called as she turned to leave. She paused, looking back at him. "I'm not giving up," he said, his eyes burning with determination. Rhea didn't reply, but as she walked back inside, a small smile played at the corners of her lips. Benjamin had always been good at hiding his emotions, but something about Rhea was dismantling the walls he'd spent years constructing. She was a paradox, soft yet strong, fragile yet resilient. And the way she stood her ground against him, challenging his every move, left him reeling. Sitting at his desk, he stared blankly at the stack of paperwork in front of him. His office, usually a haven where he could bury himself in work and forget the world, now felt suffocating. The memory of Rhea's voice, her piercing gaze, and the way she called him out without hesitation replayed in his mind like a song on repeat. "Benjamin," a voice called, snapping him out of his reverie. It was Kai, standing in the doorway with a bemused expression. "You've been sitting there for an hour and haven't touched a thing. What's going on with you?" Benjamin rubbed his temples. "Nothing. Just thinking." Kai leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You mean brooding? Let me guess, it's about Rhea." Benjamin shot him a glare, but Kai only smirked. "It's written all over your face, man. You're not as unreadable as you think you are." "Drop it, Kai," Benjamin warned, his tone sharp. Kai raised his hands in mock surrender. Fine, but whatever's going on, you need to figure it out. You're no good to anyone if you're this distracted." As Kai walked away, Benjamin couldn't help but wonder if he was right. But figuring it out was easier said than done. Rhea hadn't seen Benjamin in days, and while part of her was relieved, another part of her felt disappointed. She hated how much space he occupied in her thoughts, how his presence lingered even when he wasn't around. Preki had noticed her distraction and called her into his office. "Rhea," he began, leaning back in his chair, "is everything all right?" "Yes," she lied, forcing a smile. "Why do you ask?" Preki studied her for a moment. "You've been different lately, distracted. Does this have anything to do with Benjamin?" Her stomach dropped. "Why would you think that?" "Because I've seen the way he looks at you," Preki said, his tone cautious. "And the way you look at him." Rhea's cheeks burned, but she quickly shook her head. "There's nothing between us." "Are you sure about that?" Preki asked, his gaze unwavering. "Because if there is, you need to be careful. Benjamin's not the kind of man you can easily walk away from." His words hit her like a warning bell, but she couldn't deny the truth in them. Benjamin was a storm, unpredictable, intense, and impossible to ignore. That evening, Benjamin showed up at the community center unannounced. Rhea had just finished her shift and was walking to her car when she saw him leaning against it, his hands shoved into his pockets. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice laced with both curiosity and frustration. "I needed to see you," he admitted, standing upright. "Can we talk?" She hesitated, glancing around the nearly empty parking lot. "About what?" "About us," he said, his voice steady. Rhea's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly masked her reaction. "There is no us, Benjamin." "Don't lie to me, Rhea," he said, stepping closer. "I know you feel it too, this connection between us, and it's not just in my head." She looked away, her resolve wavering. "Even if I did feel something, it doesn't matter. You're still hung up on Ashley. You haven't moved on." Her words hit him like a slap, but he knew she was right. "I won't lie to you," he said after a long pause. "Ashley will always be a part of me. But what I feel for you, it's different. It's real." Rhea's eyes filled with unshed tears. "You don't even know me, Benjamin. You're projecting your feelings for Ashley onto me because I remind you of her." "That's not true," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "Yes, you remind me of her, but you're not her, and I don't want you to be." She stared at him, her heart battling her head. "Why me?" Benjamin smiled faintly, the vulnerability in his eyes taking her breath away. "Because you make me feel alive again, and I don't want to lose that." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. Finally, Rhea took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can do this." "I'm not asking you to make a decision right now," he said. "Just don't shut me out." She nodded hesitantly, her heart pounding as she got into her car and drove away. Benjamin watched her go, a mixture of hope and fear swirling in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he was fighting for something worth holding on to. The weeks passed slowly for both Benjamin and Rhea. They interacted minimally, only when necessary, and the distance between them grew, yet the tension never truly dissipated. Benjamin found himself lost in thought more often, haunted by the moments they spent together and the longing he couldn't shake. One evening, after finishing her shift at the community center, Rhea sat alone at a small coffee shop, sipping on a cup of tea. She glanced out the window, watching the street slowly empty of people. A familiar shadow fell across the glass, and her breath caught in her throat. Benjamin. He stood by the window, watching her quietly. When their eyes met, the air seemed to shift. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice soft, yet defensive. "I thought you could use some company," he said gently, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. Rhea frowned, unsure how to react. "That's not necessary." Benjamin leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. "It is. I've missed you, Rhea, more than I care to admit." "I don't know what you want from me," she said, lowering her gaze. "I want you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not Ashley, not some ideal version of you, just you. And if you let me, I want to show you what that means." Her heart ached as the honesty in his words sank in, but she was afraid. Afraid of what giving in might cost her, afraid of losing herself in someone else again. "I don't know if I can," she said softly. Benjamin reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. "I'm not asking you to change who you are. I just want to walk this path with you, whatever it may lead to." For a moment, she was silent, staring down at their joined hands. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that he wasn't just looking for an escape. But her past had taught her caution, and her heart was hesitant to take the leap. "I need more time," she whispered. "I'll wait," he said with a soft smile. A few days later, Rhea invited Benjamin to a charity event at the community center. She was organizing it with Preki, and the event was aimed at raising funds for underprivileged children in their community. The atmosphere was lively, filled with warmth and generosity. As the evening unfolded, Benjamin found himself immersed in conversations with Rhea, observing her natural ease with the children, the way her laughter echoed through the hall. He noticed how her eyes would light up every time she spoke about her passion, helping those in need. "Your eyes glow when you talk about this," he said softly during a break. "It's important to me," she replied, a smile playing on her lips. "Giving back is what grounds me." Benjamin studied her, captivated by the sincerity in her voice. "You're incredible," he said honestly. Rhea lowered her gaze, a faint blush rising to her cheeks. "Stop," she murmured, shaking her head. "You don't know me." "But I want to," he said, his voice earnest. Later, when the event ended, they walked to her car in comfortable silence. Benjamin hesitated before speaking again. "Do you ever think about what could be different if we weren't so caught up in the past?" Rhea sighed, unlocking her car door. "Sometimes, but it's not that easy, Benjamin." "I know," he said softly, "but I'm willing to try." The following day, Benjamin found Rhea at the community center, sorting through donations. He stood by the entrance, watching her quietly until she noticed his presence. "You didn't have to come," she said, though her tone held a trace of warmth. "I did," he replied, stepping closer. "I need to talk to you." "What is it?" she asked, her brow furrowed. Benjamin took a deep breath, the weight of his words pressing against his chest. "Rhea, I've been thinking a lot about us, about what we have, and what we could have if we were given the chance. But I can't keep pretending like it doesn't matter to me anymore. You matter, and I need to know if you feel the same way." Rhea's eyes searched his, her breath hitching. The vulnerability in his expression was disarming. "Benjamin," she began, her voice trembling. He interrupted gently. "Just answer honestly. Don't hold back." After a moment, she whispered, "I don't know." Benjamin's heart sank, but he nodded understandingly. "That's enough for me. For now." Rhea looked away, the weight of her own conflicted emotions suffocating. "I need time to figure things out." "Take all the time you need," he said, offering her a small, reassuring smile. They stood in silence for a few moments longer, the air thick with unspoken words. Finally, Benjamin gave a slight nod and turned to leave. Rhea watched him walk away, her chest heavy with emotions. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt less alone. And despite her uncertainty, she found herself clinging to hope. Days passed, and the bond between Rhea and Benjamin continued to grow, though slowly. Their interactions were more frequent, more comfortable, yet there was still an underlying tension neither of them could fully shake. The past hung between them like an invisible barrier, but they were determined to move forward, even if just an inch at a time. One evening, after finishing another community event, Benjamin walked Rhea home. The streets were quiet, illuminated only by the dim streetlights. The crisp night air was filled with the sound of rustling leaves and distant laughter. "Thank you for coming," Rhea said softly, her voice breaking the silence. Benjamin smiled, his eyes gentle. "It's hard to stay away when you're involved in something so important." Rhea chuckled lightly. "You say that like I have you chained to my side." Benjamin laughed, his deep voice warming the air between them. "Maybe I like being chained." Rhea shook her head but didn't argue. She appreciated the lightness he brought into her life. "How are you, really?" He paused for a moment, his expression softening. "I'm doing better. Talking to you helps." "I hope you know that I'm not pushing you," she said quietly, stopping in front of her house. "I don't want you to feel like you have to be someone you're not." Benjamin reached out, brushing a stray hair from her face. "You don't get to tell me who I am." Rhea's breath hitched. "Benjamin." "I'm not afraid anymore," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not afraid of what comes next." A gentle smile crossed her lips. You shouldn't be. Despite their growing connection, the past continued to haunt both of them. Rhea often found herself thinking about Ashley, wondering if Benjamin had truly let go of the memories. Meanwhile, Benjamin grappled with his own insecurities, afraid of being left behind once again. One evening, they found themselves sitting in a quiet cafe, surrounded by soft music and the warmth of dim lighting. Rhea's fingers traced patterns on the table as Benjamin stared into his coffee, lost in thought. "Are you okay?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. Benjamin gave a small nod, though his eyes reflected a sadness she couldn't ignore. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "Every day, I'm trying to be better." Rhea reached across the table and took his hand in hers. "You are. Sometimes it feels like I'm still holding onto pieces of who I used to be," he admitted, his voice low. "I don't want to lose you, Rhea. I don't want to be someone who makes you regret caring." Her heart ached for him. "You're not that person," she said softly. "You're someone who's healing, and that takes time. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be real." Benjamin squeezed her hand gently, his gaze meeting hers with a quiet intensity. "Thank you." As the days turned into weeks, Benjamin and Rhea grew closer, but their connection was still delicate. The bond they shared was built on trust, and that trust was something neither could afford to break. They knew that moving forward wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. One evening, under the stars, Benjamin took a deep breath, his hand firmly holding Rhea's. "I want to take this leap with you." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Are you sure?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "You've shown me what it means to be seen, really seen, and I want to give that back to you." Rhea smiled softly, a tear escaping her eye. "Then let's do this together." In that moment, the past faded away, replaced by the hope of a future built on honesty, understanding, and love. They didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but for the first time, neither cared. Their hearts beat as one, their spirits intertwined, ready to face whatever came next, as long as they were together. Days turned into weeks, and Benjamin and Rhea continued to navigate their path forward. They spent more time together, sharing moments that strengthened their bond. Conversations no longer felt strained, and silences weren't as heavy. Still, the world around them hadn't stopped spinning. Challenges came at every corner, testing their resolve, but together, they faced them head-on. One evening, after a long day, Benjamin sat on the couch in Rhea's small apartment. The room was cozy, with soft lighting and the scent of fresh flowers on the table. Rhea entered from the kitchen, a cup of tea in her hands, and placed it in front of him. "How's work?" she asked gently, sitting beside him. Benjamin took a sip of the tea, the warmth spreading through him. "It's manageable. I've been thinking about my father's project. It's not as straightforward as I thought." Rhea leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "You don't have to figure it out alone. We're a team now." He smiled, wrapping his arm around her. "A team, huh? That has a nice ring to it." They stayed in comfortable silence for a while, the world outside dimming in importance. Rhea knew that while Benjamin had made progress, there were still moments where his past would creep in. She had witnessed the flashes of uncertainty in his eyes, the moments when the walls he had built seemed to crumble a little. One afternoon, after a community event, Benjamin found Rhea sitting on the porch of her apartment. She was sketching, lost in the world she created on paper. He sat beside her, watching as her fingers moved with grace and purpose. "You're really talented," he said softly, admiring the intricate details. Rhea looked up at him, her eyes sparkling. "Thank you. It helps me focus when everything else feels chaotic." Benjamin touched her hand gently, intertwining their fingers. "You give me focus, too. I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again." Her smile was gentle. "You deserve to feel this way. You deserve happiness." He kissed her softly, the gesture filled with gratitude and trust. It was a simple act, but it spoke volumes about the connection they shared. In that kiss, there was no past, no hesitation. just two people coming together in understanding. Despite their growing love, Benjamin knew there were still hurdles they had to overcome. One evening, after a long discussion with his stepfather, Jackson, Benjamin felt a weight settle in his chest. Jackson had brought up the complexities of family legacy, the responsibilities Benjamin would eventually inherit. As he walked home, his mind swirled with thoughts of the future, of how his role could change everything they had built with Rhea. "You're lost in thought," Rhea said, noticing his quiet demeanor when he entered her apartment. Benjamin sighed, sitting beside her on the couch. "Jackson thinks I need to be ready to take over the family's business. But that means stepping back into a world I don't want to return to." Rhea took his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You don't have to do it alone. We can figure this out together." His eyes met hers, the weight in his chest lessened. "I don't deserve someone like you." "You deserve everything," she replied, her voice steady. "We're in this together, remember?" He nodded, his heart finding solace in her words. Together. One evening, after attending a family gathering, Benjamin and Rhea returned to her apartment. The evening had been filled with awkward conversations and old stories. Yet, as they sat in the quiet of her home, the tension began to lift. Rhea handed Benjamin a small box. "I thought this might make you smile." He opened it slowly, revealing a silver bracelet with a delicate charm. A small, intricate symbol of two intertwined hearts. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You've given me pieces of your heart," she said softly. "I thought it was only fair that I gave you a piece of mine." Benjamin pulled her into a tight embrace, the weight of his gratitude filling the room. "You've already given me so much more." As the days turned into weeks, Benjamin and Rhea continued to build a life together, though remnants of their past still lingered. One afternoon, while strolling through a park, Benjamin became quiet, his mind once again drifting into the shadows of old memories. "What's on your mind?" Rhea asked gently, her hand brushing against his. He sighed, looking up at the sky. "Just thinking about how much I've lost. My wife, Ashley. Sometimes, it feels like I'm betraying her by moving forward." Rhea stopped walking and faced him, her expression tender. "Loving you doesn't take away the love you had for her. You're not betraying her, Benjamin. You're honoring her by choosing to live." He took a deep breath, holding onto her hand tightly. "It's hard to let go of the guilt, Rhea. She's always in my thoughts, in my dreams." Rhea leaned her head against his shoulder. "She'll always be a part of you, but so am I. And that's not something to be afraid of." The sun set slowly over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city as Benjamin and Rhea sat in the garden of her apartment complex. They had grown together, their love grounding them in a world that was constantly shifting. Benjamin looked at her with a soft smile. "This is our home now. With you, everything feels possible." Rhea smiled back, her eyes shimmering in the fading light. "And we'll build it together. No matter what comes, we'll face it side by side." As they held hands, the world felt quieter. No past, no burdens, just two people who found strength in each other's presence. Together, they were healing, creating a future that was theirs alone to shape. And in that moment, they knew that every challenge they had faced had brought them to this place. A place of hope, love, and new beginnings. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.